Yeah. And also, Peggy, I think, the way you're writing about the different skills that you learned or explored along the way, it's familiar in a way, and yet your experiences are new and different and unique. And I'd love if we could take just a second, maybe just to do a lightning round for each of the different techniques that you explore through the course of your journey. I'm fascinated by all of it. So, like when you first started and you got into shearing, what you know what on earth led you to do that?
you know, naivete would be the short answer. I
Too dumb to know better.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes I really think that's it. It's just like I always wanted to do that. Like I said, I have a real curiosity, a journalist curiosity, and a handworker's curiosity about where this stuff all came from. And so I actually had done an event in Santa Rosa recently, and somebody who's in Girls and Sex came, somebody that's sort of the hero of the book Girls and Sex, one of my previous books. And she said, you were following me around in 2012 talking about how you wanted to learn to shear sheep. And I thought, so this is it's not a new thing that I wanted to do this. I just never had time or could do it. And I just didn't understand. I mean, you kind of think like sheep, cute. That they're bigger than you are. And of course, you all know, because you're knitters, that sheep need to be shorn, that it's not cruel, that in fact it's cruel not to shear them, they will die. But that they're bigger, they're covered with lanolin, they've got hooves, they don't really want to be there. It doesn't hurt them, but they don't really want to be there. And it calorie or minute for minute burns twice as many calories as marathon running. I looked at all that and went, yeah, sure, sign me up. I'm almost 60, no problem. It was so hard. And I didn't, and you've got a hot whirring blade doing this with no safety, it's crazy hard. And while the sheep was fine, it looked like a crime scene because I was just cutting off the tops of my fingers, right? It was
So Rebecca would like to know exactly how many sheep did you shear, and I would like to know, of course, how much you yielded at the end of this experience.
I sheared 3 and got a little better with each one, though not good. And I got enough to barely make my sweater, but I was very careful. And my sweater weighs 3 pounds, so and I'll show it to you towards the end of this. But I didn't want to. The one thing was I spun different yarn from comb top yarns to practice dyeing, so I wouldn't waste my sheep's name. The sheep whose fleece I eventually used was named Martha, so I thought of it as my Martha. I did not want my precious Martha. I would not.
All right, yeah. So you have 3 sheep's worth of fleece.
Mm-hmm.
Hard won, sounds like. Very proud. The next thing you had to do was you had to prep it. So
nobody told me about that part. Yeah, there's a lot of poop involved there. So
vegetable matter.
Vegetable matter. I call it
vegetable matter.
Yeah, there's a lot of vegetable matter. So yeah, obviously the rinsing and the washing, and then the carding, which is incredibly tedious. And in case for the, you might not, you probably know again, but in case you don't, you take 2 things that look like dog brushes and you're doing this back and forth till it's nice and fluffy, and then you roll it into this like puffy thing. And it would take me about 10 minutes to do that because I wasn't, again, good at it. And you need, I don't know where I read this, 579 of those puffs to make a sweater. Then you spin them, to make a sweater. 10 minutes per puff meant forever. Forever. But the thing was that while I was doing it, and I knew that one of the braids in this book was going to be about my mom, who had taught me to knit, and that was a real theme in the book: women's mothers teaching them to knit, and the things that we learned from our mothers, the things we don't, the things we wish we did, the things we wish we didn't, the things we pass on to our daughters, the things we don't want to pass on to our daughters, all told through this kind of knitting metaphor. But I didn't know that it was going to bring me very close to my dad, it was lockdown. He was 94 then, he's since died. And he was in a facility, had dementia, hearing impairment. It was really hard to, who knew how long this was going to go on? Didn't know if I was ever going to see him again. hard to connect across those impairments. But when I was carding, I was just sitting there, for hours, and his aide would put him up on FaceTime, and we would just sit there together. And he would, say things like, "Hey, Peg, can you hand me that glass of water?" And I'd be like, "Dad, no, I can't reach it." And we would sing, because the part of the brain that stores lyrics is different from the part that is, at least initially, affected by dementia. Eventually it got there, but it took a long time. And now that he's gone, I just am so that time is a treasure to me. Like, in our whole relationship of my whole life, I treasure that time that I was able to, because of doing that ancient art, just stop and be there with him.
That's amazing.
So that was the carding. That was the prep.
Wow. It's so interesting that something that slow was the way that you were able to be with him. I found my own father died a year ago, and it really is a time when it's surreal, right? It feels in time and out of time. And especially for you to be doing it virtually, I just think that's extraordinary. And what a treasure that you had.
Yeah,
that.
because I couldn't. It was impossible to connect with him from far away like that. When my mom died too, I sat next to her bed as she was dying, and was knitting a sweater. And in the end, that's the sweater I can't wear. Although now I think if I still had it, I gave it away. Now I think if I still had it, I think I would be able to. But for a long time, I couldn't.
Yeah. All right. So you prepped your fleece in a pretty profound way. Then you get to the spinning of your fleece. To me, spinning is real hard. I don't think spinning is something that I've got the hang of at all. I've been trying to learn it, off and on. And how'd that go?
I love spinning. The drop spindle I find very difficult, but I loved the wheel. I really loved the wheel, but I would get very frustrated. And, throughout the book, and there was so much in the lore. Spinning is so endemic to who women are. I write about the 3 fates of Greek myth, who are spinners, and how Clotho, the maiden, spins the fiber of our lives, of every baby's life. And then the matron cuts it, and then the Atropos, the crone, which means both, sort of the hag, but also wisdom and justice, cuts it off at the end of life. And so thinking about that, and it made so much sense to me that the creators of life should be women. That what do we do but create things out of, make fiber from fluff, and make bread from flour, and make human beings from nowhere at all. That is our magic, and that is, what could be more divine? So there was so much about that, and creation myths throughout the world that involve weaving, that involve spinning, the fairy tales. And then, the spinning chapter, I think you're right, I'm the most frustrated, I think, in that. The sheep thing was just wild, but there's this frustration as I'm learning to spin, even though I also love it, because I can't get it right. And through so much of the book, I'm pushing back against that. And then there's a point, and I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but it's in the chapter on blue, where I realize that's the point. The point is that I can't do it. The point is I'm forced to have the beginner's mind. I'm forced into it. And as somebody who does something creative sort of for a living, so often, I don't know if you find this, because you do too, that it gets bound up in commerce and sales, and like, are you going to be able to continue doing it? Are you going to be able to make a living? And, all this kind of stuff. And that erodes some of the joy and creativity. And being able to do something where I could get back and just, feel the process, and be the amateur, and not focus on what that result was going to be. And that's why, in a way, why I wanted to call it, people keep saying the sweater's not that ugly. The subtitle is that it's the world's ugliest sweater. It's not that ugly, and it's not, but it didn't matter whether it wasn't. Part of it was that was funny, and I couldn't resist the funny, but it was also because it didn't matter. Like the outcome was not the point. And that was a really big lesson.
This line that you wrote that I really kind of laughed out loud at it, because I think it's so resonant for women of our generation, when you said, I'm going to try and get an A in everything you can get an A in. And I think what we sort of have learned through life is there's a grade on everything. You know, there's very little that you can't try to get an A in. And I even see it in our beloved craft of knitting when, you know, when I'm with learners, I see people just judging beginners, just judging themselves so harshly that they can't get it right away. And that does get in the way of the pleasure of just doing it. That
you know,
there's a
I
real
think,
pleasure in doing
yeah,
these.
I mean, that may be one of the biggest things that I've taken away from our 20 years of knitting, Kay, is this feeling of reveling in the beginner's mind. Like at this point, you know, we have this series of field guides that we publish, and there's something in there that I haven't tried pretty much every time, you know, one way or another. And it's so true that, you know, you aim really hard to do things really well and you want to get approval. But what's so great about knitting is that it's just for ourselves, you know, it truly is a very private thing if you want it to be. And so you can just suck at it, you know, you can just be.
You can let go of, and I think we've over time, you know, the word humbling is the right word, but it sounds like a bad thing, humbling. But it's actually a good thing. I'm very humble in the face of knitting, even though I've been doing it for decades now. It's always entertaining. It's always a bit difficult. You know, it always has a challenge to it, and you can always solve it. And I think you do that over and over again in this book. Like you run into an unexpected challenge because you just didn't think it was going to be that hard. And then you have to solve it because you've set yourself this goal of doing this thing.
And I mean, when you mentioned the A, that it's funny because women of our age bring that one up all the time. I think that's a really important one. And also that, you know, it's okay to suck. I write about this in my office. I used to have this Linda Berry cartoon up. I don't know if y'all remember Linda Berry, but her. I know, me too. And it starts with, it's called The Two Questions. And she talks about how when she was a child, she just had this like free flowing creativity and just art would just pour out of her and all this crazy stuff. And then there's a certain point where you start asking what she calls the two questions, which are, is this good or does this suck? And as soon as you start asking those questions, that's like the death of creativity. And there's this phrase that I'd come across in another piece that I'd written years ago called creative mortification, which is this idea that, you know, when you're young and you're doing something that you love, whether it's like, you know, art or music or playing a sport or knitting or, you know, whatever it is, whatever your thing, self-expression is, and somebody gives you a too harsh critique, and you put that paintbrush or knitting needles or test tube or whatever it is down, and you don't pick it up again. It's the mortification. And what you learn to ask, what they suggest you do to offset that creative mortification, to get rid of those two questions, is to, you know, embrace that beginner's mind, but to approach your work with curiosity and to think, you know, well, ask questions like, what worked here? You know, what could I do differently next time? And instead of asking these definitive, is it good, is it suck, does it suck kind of questions. And that is the thing of learning to value. And I think this is what, for me, knitting in particular is about, is valuing the process. And yes, I like to have beautiful things when I'm done. Yes, I like it if it's wearable or I can put it on my couch. But I also, I mean, part of knitting for me, and I don't even mind unknitting that much, because it's just process. It's just process.